Left with nothing, a Navy SEAL and his dog built a silo home. It was the only one standing. There is a grain silo standing on the edge of the Harrow farmland in Dillon Creek, Montana that has not held grain in 30 years. It held something else last February. It held 34 people through the worst blizzard the Bitterroot Valley had seen in 31 years. It held them while the town around it disappeared under 6 feet of snow, and the power went out, and the highway closed, and everything the people of Dillon Creek had built their sense of safety on stopped being enough. It held them while a county official who had been trying to take it for 4 months sat in the corner and said absolutely nothing. And it held them because one man had built it to hold. Quietly, without anyone asking him to, without anyone thanking him for it, while the town drove past and shook its head and gave the project a nickname they would spend the following spring pretending they had never used. The man's name was Caleb Rains. He was 44 years old, and he had arrived in Dillon Creek on a Tuesday in October with a dark green pickup truck, a white German Shepherd, and $4,100, which was everything he had left after 17 years of serving a country that had taken most of what he gave it and a marriage that had taken the rest. He had not come to Dillon Creek with a plan that would make sense to anyone looking at it from the outside. He had come because the driving had brought him here, and because the silo had been standing in the October field when he drove past, and something in him had gone still in a way that nothing had gone still in 14 months. And when Caleb Rains went still about something, it meant he had already decided. It just meant the rest of the world had not caught up yet. His dog's name was Ridge. And Ridge had been trying to tell him something for 3 days before the storm arrived. Stay with me. Because what Ridge found inside that eastern foundation wall, and what a man named Gerald Foss did not know was buried there, and what 34 people discovered about the grain silo they had been laughing at for 4 months, all of it is coming. And it will stay with you long after this ends. There is a particular kind of October in mountain valleys that exists for exactly 2 weeks before the season makes its final decision and commits entirely to winter. A window of cold clarity where the air is sharp enough to think in, and the light comes down through the turning aspens at an angle that makes everything it touches look briefly worth keeping. Dillon Creek, Montana sat inside that October on the second Tuesday of the month, and it was into that light that Caleb Rains drove his dark green pickup down off the mountain highway and into the valley with the unhurried pace of a man who has already decided where he is going and for whom the going is simply the going. Not a race, not a performance, just the final distance between a decision made and a decision arrived at. He was 44 years old and looked it in the specific way that men look their age when the years have been earned rather than simply accumulated. The weathering in his face, not the weathering of neglect but the weathering of use, the kind that maps real experience onto a person's surface and stays there as evidence rather than complaint. His hair was dark brown and close cropped and going silver at the temples, and his eyes were a deep gray-green that processed everything they encountered without broadcasting the processing, taking in a room or a ridge or a person with the focused efficiency of someone trained to read environments quickly and accurately. There was a burn scar running from his right jaw down to his collarbone, old enough now to have become simply one of his features, present and permanent and no longer requiring explanation. Beside him rode Ridge. Ridge was 5 years old and 94 pounds of white German Shepherd with a coat so densely brilliant and so specifically white that he seemed in certain lights to generate his own illumination. His eyes were pale amber gold, the specific warm amber of late afternoon light on old pine, and they had the quality that certain working dogs develop over years of serious application, the quality of eyes that are always reading, always processing, never quite fully at rest. He had been trained as a structural collapse detection dog in a military program that had certified fewer than a dozen animals in the country for the dual qualification of avalanche debris location and building collapse survivor detection. He had been paired with Caleb during the final operational years of Caleb's service, and in the 5 years since, the bond between them had long since stopped being something that required demonstration and had become simply the permanent shape of how both of them moved through the world. Together. With the mutual understanding of two creatures who have been tested in conditions that mattered and have found the other one reliable in the ways that count. Caleb had served 17 years in the United States Navy, the last 12 as a SEAL. The last operational posting had been a mountain in northern Norway where his 4-man team had been caught by a snowpack release that took his 3 teammates in 4 seconds and left him thrown clear with 2 broken ribs, a broken wrist, and the specific interior damage that does not appear on any imaging equipment but that changes the shape of a person permanently. Ridge had found all 3 of his teammates in the debris field, 11 minutes, 0 visibility, compressed snow. 2 had come out alive. 1 had not. Caleb had spent 3 days on that Norwegian mountainside waiting for extraction, and had come home to a medical discharge and a marriage that had been surviving his absences for 12 years and had decided it could not survive what came back from Norway in their place. The divorce had been clean because Sarah was a clean-thinking person and because Caleb had not contested anything she asked for. She had told him to take Ridge at the end. Not cruelly. She had looked at the dog and then at Caleb and said take him. And in those 2 words was everything she understood about what he was going to need that she was no longer going to be able to provide. He had driven away from Nashville on a Tuesday morning in August with $4,100 and the dog and the interior silence of a man who has lost enough in a short enough time that the losing has become its own weather. Present and ongoing, and something you move through rather than something you resolve. The silo had stopped him. That was the only accurate way to describe what happened when he drove past the Harrow farmland on his second morning in Dillon Creek and saw it standing in the October field. It had stopped him the way certain things stop certain people. Not because of anything explainable from the outside but because of something that connected to a specific interior knowledge and said this. He had walked the property twice with Ridge at his heel and stood at the base of the structure with both palms flat against the concrete and felt what the concrete had to say, which was solid, which was here, which was built by someone who understood that the cost of building something that fails is always higher than the cost of building something that holds. He had driven to the county office and paid $800 and come back and started working before the afternoon light was gone. Pete Garland at the hardware store had been the first person to speak to him, without the guarded quality that most of Dillon Creek's initial interactions carried. He had come out of his store on Caleb's second supply run and said, "You must be the fellow who bought the Harrow silo," and Caleb said yes, and Pete said his father had told him the man who built it in 1961 had poured the foundation 3 feet deeper than the county required because he had decided the county requirement was a minimum and minimums were for people who did not care what happened to their building in 40 years. Caleb had looked at him with those gray-green eyes and said that was useful to know. That had been the beginning of the only genuinely easy friendship Caleb developed in Dillon Creek. The work he did on the silo over the following 6 weeks did not announce itself. It proceeded quietly and systematically. Interior insulation first, a double-wall system installed with the thoroughness of someone who has spent time in environments where the quality of your shelter determines whether you are alive in the morning. Then the radiant floor system, connected to a wood gasification boiler. Sleeping platforms along the curved walls. Supply shelving at the rear stocked with the organized precision of someone for whom preparation is not a project but a reflex. Food, water, medical kit, emergency lighting. The things that bodies need to survive for days in an enclosed space when the world outside has become temporarily uninhabitable. Roy Keswick at the feed supply named it the Tin Can on the 3rd week, and the name spread through Patty's Diner the way accurate nicknames spread in small towns, completely and without attribution, until it was simply the established vocabulary for the project and the man behind it. The consensus was warm and consistent. The tin can was an impractical idea pursued by a man whose judgment had perhaps been affected by whatever he had been through, and the mountain would settle the question before spring in the manner it always settled these questions. Gerald Foss watched from a different angle entirely. Foss was 57 and had been county land assessor for 11 years and had the specific bearing of a man for whom minor institutional authority had become indistinguishable from his personality. Thin-faced and precise, with careful gray eyes behind frameless glasses and the professional habit of smiling slightly while delivering information that was not good news. He had been watching the Harrow parcel for 2 years as part of a land acquisition process he was conducting through a shell company called Ridgeline Holdings, a company that did not appear in any public record connected to his name but was connected by exactly 2 removes through a holding structure he had arranged with the care of a man who understands that the distance between a thing and its origin needs to be measurable in paper rather than in fact. The parcel sat in the path of an access corridor that a resort development company in Billings needed, and Foss stood to benefit from the deal in ways that would become clear only if someone examined the paperwork and knew what they were looking for. He had not anticipated Caleb Rains. He had driven past the silo twice in the first week, seen enough to understand that a direct approach was not going to work, and gone back to the county office to review the 1987 structural compliance records. He filed the condemnation order on a Thursday in November, 31 days after Caleb had moved in. 3 violations, technically accurate and selectively enforced, present in similar form on 6 other properties in the county that Foss had chosen not to act on because acting on them served no purpose he was interested in. Caleb had read the order once, set it on the workbench, and continued working. Foss sent a follow-up letter the following week with language designed to communicate that the 30-day clock was running and the outcome was not negotiable. Caleb drove to Pete's store and told him in the compressed, accurate way he told Pete things that the county was attempting to remove him through a compliance process with the legal appearance of legitimacy and the actual substance of something else. Pete told him about 2 previous properties on the western side of the valley. Similar processes, similar timing, both people gone. Nobody had connected them publicly, but people had noticed, and the noticing had not produced action because action required someone to sit down and do the specific work of connecting things that had been arranged to look unconnected. Caleb looked at Pete for a moment and said he understood. He drove back to the silo and opened his laptop and began doing exactly that work. Sarah Montoya stopped at the silo on a Tuesday afternoon in the 3rd week of November. She had been driving past the access road for 3 weeks and postponing the stop and had on this afternoon decided to stop postponing it. She walked up the track and waited at a respectful distance and said, "What is this going to be?" Caleb said, "A home." She said, "It looks like more than a home." He was quiet a moment and then said, "It is also a shelter." She said, "For what?" He looked at the Bitterroot Range above the valley, at the ridgeline and the snowpack building on it with the accumulation pattern of a winter that intended to be serious, and then back at her and said, "For whatever comes." She nodded. She looked at Ridge, who had come to stand between them, and was reading her with those amber-gold eyes with the calm assessment of a working dog evaluating someone new. She said, "Is he a rescue dog?" Caleb said yes. She looked at the mountain for a moment and then back at Caleb and said, "My daughter is 8 years old and her name is Lily, and we live on Meridian Street on the north side of town, and I would very much like it if you would tell me if you ever have specific reason to think we should not be in our house." Caleb looked at her with the expression of a man receiving unexpectedly direct thinking and giving it honest attention. He said he would tell her. She said thank you and walked back to her car. Ridge watched her go. Then he returned to the eastern foundation wall. Caleb watched his dog that evening for a long time. For days of this now, the same section of wall, the same focused patient presence, the same quality of settled certainty that was not the behavior of a dog working a problem but the behavior of a dog who has already resolved the problem and is waiting for his human to arrive at the same place. Caleb had examined that section 3 times. He had pressed his palms against it, tapped it with his knuckles, examined the old anchor bolts and the drainage channel at the base, and found nothing his eyes could resolve into meaning. But Ridge had never in 5 years done a thing without reason. The eastern wall was not going to become the first exception to that record, simply because Caleb could not yet see what the dog already knew. He filed it in the part of himself that held things requiring more information, and went back to the laptop and the documents, and outside the Bitterroot Range held its breath in the specific way of a mountain completing its final preparation. The tin can stood on the Harrow farmland in the last of the November light. Warm inside. Full of things a man had put there for a day the town had not yet agreed was coming. Ridge was at the eastern wall. And somewhere in that concrete, 31 years of silence was about to end. The storm did not announce itself the way storms announce themselves in places where the infrastructure exists to receive the announcement. There was no emergency broadcast that reached every phone simultaneously, no coordinated alert from the county emergency management office, no school closure notification sent to parents the night before. There was the weather radio at Pete Garland's hardware store that Pete checked every morning the way he checked his inventory, methodically and without drama. And what the weather radio said on the morning of the 14th of February was that a system moving down from the Canadian border had accelerated overnight and was now projected to make contact with the Bitterroot Valley sometime in the early afternoon rather than the following morning as previously forecast, with accumulation estimates revised upward 3 times in the past 18 hours, and that now stood at figures Pete read twice before he picked up the phone and called Caleb Rains. Caleb answered on the first ring. Pete told him what the radio said. There was a pause of perhaps 4 seconds, the pause of a man running information through a specific internal calculation, and then Caleb said he would start calling and hung up, and Pete understood without being told that start calling meant Caleb was going to begin moving people toward the silo, and that Pete's job was to know every family on the north end of town by name and address and to start driving. Caleb's calls went in the order he had already worked out in his mind, because Caleb Rains did not improvise the sequence of critical actions when the time for those actions arrived. He executed the sequence he had prepared, because preparation was the whole point of everything that had come before this moment. Sarah Montoya first, because she had a child and lived on the north side and needed the most time. Then Mayor Dale Crisp, because whatever his opinion of Caleb had been over the past 4 months, the decision to move people needed to carry official weight, and the mayor was the person whose weight it was to carry. Then Dr. Anita Marsh at the clinic, because 3 weeks earlier she had asked Caleb quietly at Pete's store whether the silo had any medical supply capacity, and Caleb had said yes, and she had said good, and neither of them had needed to say anything further because nothing further was required. Sarah answered before the first ring completed. She said she and Lily would be at the silo in 30 minutes. Caleb said 20 if she could manage it. She said she would manage it, and hung up, and he heard in the 2 seconds before the line went dead the sound of her already moving, already doing what needed to be done, and it told him everything about the kind of person she was that he had already suspected and was now confirmed. Mayor Dale Crisp answered on the 4th ring with the voice of a man applying 20 years of trained early morning functionality to a situation that was testing that training. He asked Caleb 2 questions. The first was how certain he was. Caleb said certain enough to be calling him at 6:58 in the morning. The second was how many people the silo could hold. Caleb said 40 comfortably, 50 if the situation required it. The mayor said he would start calling. He was calling before the sentence was finished, and Caleb heard in the shift of his voice the specific internal transition from the man who had been quietly skeptical of the tin can for 4 months to the man who understood that the tin can was currently the most important piece of infrastructure in Dillon Creek, Montana. The distance between those 2 versions of himself was a reckoning the mayor would have to conduct later, privately, when there was time for it. The first snow arrived at 8:43 in the morning. Not gradually. It arrived the way Bitterroot storms arrived when they had been building for days and had finally exhausted their preparation. All at once, from the north, driven horizontal by a wind that hit the valley floor with the sustained pressure of something that has made a decision and is not revisiting it. The temperature dropped 9 degrees in 40 minutes. The highway north of town closed at 9:15 when a county plow reported zero visibility at the ridge crossing, and the dispatcher made the call that the dispatcher had been trained to make when certain conditions combined in certain ways, which was to close the road and keep it closed until conditions changed. Caleb was on the valley road when the highway closed. He had been moving between houses on the north side of town for 90 minutes, knocking on doors, delivering information in the calm compressed way. He delivered information that required immediate action, directing people up the access road toward the silo with a single clear instruction that Pete had already established the route and there would be light at the entrance. He did not explain. He did not argue. He pointed and said go, and the quality of his voice and his posture said the rest, which was that this was a person who knew what he was doing in a situation that required knowing what you were doing, and people responded to that at a level below conscious choice in the way that people always respond to it. Ridge moved through the storm at Caleb's left side with the adapted efficiency of a working dog in serious winter conditions. Head lowered against the driven snow, amber gold eyes reading the environment continuously, body angled into the wind in the way of an animal that has been in conditions like this before, and has the coat and the training to move through them without the energy expenditure that uncertainty produces. He was not searching. He was accompanying. His role right now was to stay with Caleb and to be ready for the moment when the role changed, which Ridge understood the way working dogs understand the progression of an operational situation, not through any verbal briefing but through the continuous reading of everything around him. By 10:30 there were 22 people inside the silo. By 11:47 there were 31. The interior was exactly what Caleb had built it to be. Warm in the specific thorough way of a space whose insulation has been installed by someone who understands heat loss rather than simply following a specification, the radiant floor doing its quiet work beneath everyone's feet. The amber lantern light, casting the curved stone walls in the specific warmth of enclosed spaces that have been prepared for exactly this kind of occupancy. Lily had looked at the sleeping platforms and the organized supply shelves when Sarah brought her in at 9:41 and said to her mother in the matter-of-fact tone of an 8-year-old who has decided to be equal to the situation, "This is actually pretty good." Sarah had looked at her daughter, and then at Caleb across the room, and the expression on her face was not one that required interpretation. Dr. Marsh had arrived at 10:15 with her medical kit and 2 boxes of additional supplies she had clearly been maintaining in a state of readiness she had not mentioned to anyone, which Caleb noted with the quiet satisfaction of someone who recognizes preparation when he sees it. Pete Garland had worked the north end of town with the systematic efficiency of a man who knows every house and every family by name, and has spent 30 years developing the specific kind of trust that makes people follow you out into a blizzard because you told them to. Mayor Dale Crisp arrived at 11, and stood inside the entrance for a moment taking in the space and the people and the warmth, and his expression during that moment was the expression of a man conducting a private reckoning he had known was coming. He looked at Caleb, who was at the supply shelving organizing food distribution with Pete, and Caleb looked back at him with those gray-green eyes, and nothing was said because everything that needed to be said was already present in the room around them. In the 31 people who were warm and dry and fed because of what one man had built while the town watched and gave it a nickname. Dale said quietly that he owed Caleb an apology. Caleb said they could get to that later and handed him a stack of blankets and told him the family on the upper platform needed an extra layer. Dale took the blankets and went. That was the beginning and the end of the conversation, and it was exactly the right length. Gerald Foss arrived at 12:19. Alone, on foot, having driven his county truck to the base of the access road before the drifts made it impossible, and walked the remaining distance in his expensive winter coat, which had communicated its inadequacy to him in the clearest possible physical terms over the 400 yards between the truck and the entrance. He stood in the doorway, snow-covered, cold in a way that was past the management phase, the frameless glasses fogged, the precise bearing somewhat diminished by what the storm had done to it, and he looked at the interior of the structure he had been trying to condemn for 63 days. Caleb opened the door wider and stepped aside and said, "Come in." Foss came in. He did not say anything, and Caleb did not say anything, and the people around them noted the arrival and noted the silence and understood both. Dr. Marsh came and assessed his hands for frostbite and told him to sit near the boiler, and he sat, and the silo received him the way it had received everyone else, without condition, without any interest in whether he deserved it. It was at 1:44 in the afternoon that Ridge moved. He had been conducting his systematic circuit of the interior, the slow deliberate check-in with each person that he had been doing since the first arrivals, moving from platform to platform with the calm thoroughness of a working animal who has determined that his role right now is to be present for every person in the space. He had completed 4 circuits. He was beginning his 5th when he stopped. He stopped at the eastern foundation wall. Not the urgent stop of a dog who has found something active. The other stop, the settled certain stop of a dog who has been waiting for the right moment to present what he has already found, and has determined that the moment is now. He stood at the wall with his nose pressed to the concrete at a point approximately 3 feet from the floor and 2 feet from the corner, and then he turned and looked at Caleb with those amber gold eyes and did not look away. The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something is happening that the people in it do not yet understand but can feel the weight of. Caleb crossed the room and crouched beside Ridge and pressed his palm flat against the wall at the point the dog was indicating. Nothing his hand could immediately resolve. He tapped the concrete with his knuckle. Solid. He tapped it 6 inches to the left. Slightly different. He tapped it again, carefully, with the focused attention of a man who has learned to trust the difference between what sounds the same and what sounds almost the same. The resonance was not the resonance of continuous solid concrete. It was the resonance of material with a void behind it, subtle enough that he had missed it 3 times in the past 4 days when he had examined this wall without Ridge pressing his nose to the exact point. He went to the tool storage at the rear of the silo and came back with a cold chisel and a hammer. Pete Garland was beside him within 30 seconds, because Pete had been watching Ridge since the dog stopped and had understood before anyone else in the room that something was about to happen. The mortar was old, 61 years of Montana winters had done their patient work on it, and it came away in pieces with less resistance than Caleb had expected. After 7 minutes of careful work, the concrete block at the base of the indicated section shifted. Caleb worked it free and set it on the floor, and Pete held the flashlight, and inside the void behind the block was a metal case. Not large. Approximately the size of a hardcover book, 3 inches deep. Constructed from heavy-gauge steel with soldered seams and the quality of workmanship that belonged to a different era. The era when things were built to last because the person building them understood that lasting was the entire point. It was corroded at the edges in the way that metal corrodes after 6 decades in contact with concrete and moisture, but the seams had held, and when Caleb lifted it from the void and set it on the floor, the weight and solidity of it communicated something he recognized immediately. Whatever was inside had been protected by someone who intended it to be found in exactly the condition it was in. The room was entirely silent. 34 people and 1 dog, and the storm pressing its full argument against the outside walls, and inside nothing but the low sound of the boiler and the amber lantern light, and everyone watching Caleb's hands. Ridge sat back from the wall and watched with those amber gold eyes, the specific settled quality of a dog that has completed what it came to do and is now in the monitoring phase, entirely certain of what comes next and entirely patient with the time it takes humans to arrive at what the dog reached some time ago. Caleb worked the corroded latch with the cold chisel, carefully, the way you work a thing you do not want to damage. It released on the 3rd attempt. He opened the case. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had preserved them with the thoroughness that sealed metal and 61 years of undisturbed darkness can preserve things, were documents. A land survey, hand-drawn, dated March 1961, signed by a county surveyor whose precise careful hand had mapped the Harrow farmland and its adjacent parcels with the accuracy of someone who understood that property boundaries were not suggestions. A deed of covenant, the original 1961 document establishing an agricultural easement across the western approach corridor of the Harrow parcel, running in perpetuity, binding on all subsequent owners, protecting the land from commercial development. And a letter, 4 pages in the deliberate cursive of a man named Harold Harrow, dated November 1961, addressed to whoever finds this. Pete read the deed of covenant first because Pete understood property documents in the way that a man who has spent 30 years in a hardware store in a county where land disputes are a recurring feature of the conversational landscape understands them, completely and with immediate recognition of their significance. He read it once. Then he looked at Caleb with an expression that was not surprise so much as the confirmation of something he had been suspecting without being able to articulate, and he said, quietly, that the access corridor ridgeline holdings needed for the resort development ran directly across this easement. That the easement had never been extinguished. That it had been filed in the county records in 1961 and had apparently been overlooked, or not overlooked, in the title searches conducted in the past 2 years. That Gerald Foss, as county land assessor, would have been the person responsible for those title searches. And that the resort development, without legal access across this corridor, was not a development. It was a map with a line on it that went nowhere. The room received this information in the specific silence of people absorbing something that is rearranging several things simultaneously. Gerald Foss was sitting near the boiler with his expensive winter coat dried and his frameless glasses unfogged and his hands around a cup of coffee that Dr. Marsh had given him, and he heard every word Pete said, and he did not speak. He looked at the document in Pete's hands and then at Caleb and then at the floor, and the expression on his face was not the expression of a man who has been wrongly accused. It was the expression of a man who has been accurately found. The smile was gone. In its place was something much simpler and much less managed. The face of a person at the end of a thing they built carefully and watched come apart in an afternoon in a grain silo in a Montana blizzard because a white German shepherd would not stop pressing his nose against a wall. Caleb read Harold Harrow's letter that evening, when the storm had reached its peak and the silo walls were doing everything he had built them to do, which was hold. Harold Harrow had been a practical man. The letter made this clear in the first paragraph and confirmed it in every paragraph after. He had buried the documents in November 1961 because a land dispute in an adjacent county that year had shown him what happened when original documents were lost or misplaced or, he wrote the word carefully, with the deliberateness of a man choosing it precisely, mishandled. He had sealed them in the case himself, set them in the void he had left in the eastern foundation specifically for this purpose during the original construction, and mortared the block in place with his own hands. He had written the letter because he understood that a metal case in a wall communicates nothing about its own existence, and that the person who found it would need to understand not just what was inside, but why it was there and what it was meant to protect. He had written it to whoever finds this because he did not know who that would be or when or under what circumstances, only that if the documents were needed, they would be needed in a moment that mattered, and that he wanted to give the person holding them in that moment everything they needed to use them correctly. Caleb set the letter down on the workbench and sat with it for a while. Outside, the storm completed its argument against the valley with the thoroughness of something that has been building toward a statement for a long time and is finally making it. Inside the silo, 34 people were warm and fed and alive. Ridge was conducting his final circuit of the evening, moving from person to person in the amber lantern light with the slow, deliberate attention of a dog who has decided that the work of this day is not quite finished yet and is finishing it with the same thoroughness he brought to everything he did. He came to Caleb last. He stood beside the workbench and looked at the letter and then at Caleb with those amber gold eyes, and his tail moved once, slow and certain, in the way it moved when something had been completed that deserved to be acknowledged. Caleb put his hand on the dog's head. He did not say anything because there was nothing to say that the room around him had not already said more completely than any words he had access to. 34 people alive. One man's 61-year-old act of foresight meeting one dog's refusal to stop pressing his nose against a wall until the human beside him understood what the dog already knew. A grain silo standing in a buried Montana valley while everything around it disappeared under 6 feet of snow and the people inside it discovered, one by one, the specific quality of warmth that is different from the warmth that comes from a fire or a blanket or a coat, the warmth that comes from being inside something that was built for you by someone who knew you were coming even before you knew it yourself. The tin can stood. It was the only one standing. And Ridge lay down on the warm concrete floor beside the man who had followed him here, and pressed himself against Caleb's leg, and closed his amber gold eyes and rested. Finally, in the complete and unhurried way of a dog who has done what he came to do and has found it enough. It was enough. It was exactly enough.